You know that Rehnquist joke that the problem with lawyer jokes is that lay people don't think they're jokes and lawyers don't think they're funny? I don't think that they're jokes either.
I don't understand what AJ's talking about.
I just don't like lawyers. Okay, so Ajit Pai tried to make a YouTube video.
This is very off-brand, by the way. This whole "I don't like lawyers" thing.
Ajit Pai, the Trump chairman of the FCC, Trump's chairman of the SEC, Ajit Pai, tried to make a...
He's America's chairman, AJ. He's America's chairman. He doesn't represent Donald Trump. He represents America and Verizon.
He tried to make a YouTube video, and he got a DMCA takedown of his YouTube video.
What's a DMCA takedown?
A DMCA takedown is when you use copyrighted material in a YouTube video. I mean, it doesn't have to be a YouTube video, but in some sort of video, and you put it on the internet, and then the rights holder contacts the video host and says, take this down because they're violating my copyright. So Ajit Pai violated Bowers, that's Bauer with 2 A's, get it right, Bauer, Bowers Harlem Shake, and Ajit Pai used Harlem Shake and his terrible anti-net neutrality video, and Bauer issued a statement. He said, this is unacceptable. He said that I'm going to try to get this video taken down, and then he succeeded in getting the video taken down. So it just goes to show that if you're the chairman of the FCC, you shouldn't violate the copyright of Bauer. You shouldn't violate Bauer's copyright.
You should find someone else's copyright to violate.
All right, so net neutrality?
Yeah, let's talk about net neutrality, dude. What? So, we've been hearing a lot about net neutrality. What is net neutrality?
Yeah, what is it? Nobody knows.
I was hoping one of you guys knew.
Tom, what's net neutrality?
Sorry, I was writing the show notes. Or what are we talking about?
Oh, this is going to be a short episode. None of the three of us know what net neutrality is. No. Okay. Net neutrality. So net neutrality, the core concept of net neutrality is that internet service providers should not be able to prioritize certain traffic over their networks. So, for example, if Comcast came to you and said that we don't like BitTorrent, we don't like people are using BitTorrent, and we are going to intentionally discriminate against BitTorrent traffic, then consumers reasonably would complain. People want their BitTorrent to go as fast as all the rest of their traffic, and it shouldn't be at the whims of, Comcast in Philadelphia to tell me how fast my BitTorrent should go relative to my Netflix.
So AJ, why not? Why shouldn't? So it is Comcast network, right? You're renting it, certainly, but it's their network. So why shouldn't they be able to say, listen, this is the speed at which we're going to have certain traffic. This is the speed at which we're going to have other traffic. That's sort of the argument. And then there's all these arguments, which may or may not be bogus, about how, this allows them to more, by prioritizing some traffic and not prioritizing other traffic, they can actually make things more, they can make the delivery of content more efficient and thus faster. And then let me sort of put up a third argument, which may also be bogus, but which is an argument, and we should talk about it, is the idea that this allows sort of interesting packages of content to be delivered and bundled together, right? For one flat price. So as an example, Facebook has plans, I believe in India, but I believe also in other countries, where they have teamed up with whoever the wireless provider is. And they've said that, like, listen, you can get a very, very cheap wireless plan, and Facebook will be included free in that wireless plan. And effectively what's happening is Facebook is subsidizing that wireless plan. So the end consumer is paying a lower rate for that. So this is what's happening in emerging markets. It hasn't happened here. I think in emerging markets, they don't have the same, not all the countries have the same concept of net neutrality. So what's wrong with that? So in sum, I guess 3 arguments. Why shouldn't Comcast get to prioritize traffic? It's their network. It's not your network. It's not my network. And it's not Netflix's network, right? Second, what about the sort of efficiency gains from prioritizing content? And third, what about some of the things which might actually lead to lower costs? If you're a consumer and all you want is Facebook, you know what I mean? Facebook and Instagram, and you can pay, $10 a month, and you don't really care about getting anything else on the internet, Facebook will subsidize that, right? What's wrong with that?
Because they're contrary to the concept of an open internet. The answer to all three of those is that none of those three continue to allow the internet to be open. So let's talk about the history of net neutrality, and in doing so, I think we'll end up answering a lot of your questions. And then at the end of that, we can circle back to your questions. So first, there's the precursor to the open internet order. So in 2008, Comcast had decided to block or deprioritize traffic that was being carried by certain peer-to-peer networks. And consumers complained at the FCC. They filed a complaint against Comcast at the FCC, and the FCC said that it is contrary to federal policy with respect to having an open internet. And so what does that mean? Well, they basically said that the internet is not something that internet service providers should be able to choose what traffic gets prioritized, right? Everybody's traffic should be carried the same. They relied on something that they call their ancillary authority, and they said which the statute says that the commission may perform any and all acts, make such rules and regulations, and issue such orders not inconsistent with this chapter as may be necessary in the execution of its functions. The D.C. Court of Appeals struck this down in Comcast Court v. FCC in 2010, the D.C. Court of Appeals held that the commission hadn't cited sufficient statutory authority to justify this order. So what we've got so far is that the FCC has this, and don't forget, in 2008, this was the George Bush FCC, had decided that this is something that was important, but they hadn't figured out the right statutory justification for it. That brings us to the 2010 Open Internet Order. And the 2010 Open Internet Order took the Comcast holding and applied it generally to the broadband industry. And there were three core protections. The first is transparency. So they said broadband providers must disclose the network management practices, performance characteristics, and terms and conditions of their broadband services. The second protection was no blocking. So an internet service provider did not have the discretion to block lawful content, applications, or non-harmful devices. And then the third was no unreasonable discrimination. So broadband providers cannot unreasonably discriminate in transmitting lawful traffic. They can't say that certain traffic has a higher priority than other traffic unless there's some reasonable justification for that. All of these were applied to wireline broadband, like broadband carried over fiber or cable. A subset of these were applied to mobile providers. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals struck this down in Verizon v. FCC. Do y'all remember when that decision came down?
Yeah, I do remember that. And I remember that there was a distinction that was being made between different types of carriers. And I remember that there was... It was interesting. It's, as I recall it, that the D.C. Circuit said you're using the wrong form of authority to regulate these carriers. So this would be totally okay if you were regulating sort of Comcast or Verizon as you would regulate the local phone company. But you're regulating them differently. And so what you need to do, I mean, they didn't say this, but this was sort of implicit. If you want to regulate Verizon the way that you regulate the local phone company, then you need to designate Verizon the way you would regulate, or the way that you would designate not the local phone company, but a phone company, let's say. Am I getting that more or less right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So there's a difference between, in the Federal Telecom Act, there's Title I and there's Title II. And Title I applies to information services. And Title II applies to public utilities. So what's a public utility? A public utility is sort of like a fundamental service that is important to society, right? So electricity service is a public utility, or telephone service is a public utility. So what the historical context of public utility regulation has been that these are sort of services that are essential to everyday life, and that they have to be provided to customers on a non-discriminatory basis. There's something called common carrier regulation, which says that when you offer public utility services, you have to do so as a common carrier. You have to provide your services openly and on the same terms to everyone. And so I think that this sort of background, and the reason why I've taken this really circuitous route to answering Ruchit's question is that I think that it is pretty clear that access to broadband is fundamental to society, right? That it is fundamental to life in the United States that people have access to broadband services. And I think as a consequence of that, it is important not just that households have access to the internet, right? So when but it's important that businesses, right, so what the FCC calls edge providers, which are the sort of the people who provide content over the internet. So like Netflix is an edge provider and I am a consumer, right? And so if consumers have open access to the internet but edge providers don't, well, that's actually not all that useful, right? Like, who cares if I can access the internet if Netflix can't get their content to me? And so I think the best way to think about it is that, when they were expanding the telephone network, one of the things they decided is that the more people who had telephones, the more broadly useful telephones were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Right. So what they said was that, if my telephone is more valuable, the more other people have phones. So what they did is that they subsidized, rural telephone proliferation, right? Because then every single additional person who got a phone made the people who already had phones, provided them extra value. It was more people they could call, right? There were more people who could call businesses, and there were more people who could call each other. Okay, so that's true of the internet, right? The more edge providers who have access to consumers and the more consumers who have access to edge providers broadly benefits every single person who accesses the internet, right? And so if there's some sort of deal out there where Facebook is saying we want to take some class of consumers, and particularly if we're talking about folks who are disadvantaged because they happen to be low-income consumers, right? For those folks to have to have access to the internet on some sort of like substandard basis, right? That for there to be a whole class of internet consumers that Facebook has access to but Netflix doesn't, it is not just detrimental to Netflix, it's detrimental to everyone who uses the internet. And I think that is an important thing to keep in mind, right? The historical context of public utility regulation, particularly in the communications industry. So that line of thinking takes us to the second open internet order, and that was adopted in 2015. And finally, the FCC decided to reclassify broadband as a Title II service.
And what does that mean? What's the practical effect of that? Does that mean that the broadband services? And so when we say broadband, what we mean is like Comcast, for example, right, or Time Warner. That means they are now how are they regulated as a result of that 2015 decision?
Well, and so this has been a real point of misinformation by opponents of net neutrality, right? So what everybody said is that Title II regulation is onerous. It applies to public utility. It's these aren't public utilities. This is difficult and blah, blah, blah. And I think all of that is bogus. Right. So what the FCC actually said is that we're going to apply the standard open internet protections that we've been trying to apply since 2008. And then they said, and I'll quote from the order, in finding that broadband internet access service is subject to Title II, we simultaneously exercise the Commission's forbearance authority to forbear from 30 statutory provisions and render over 700 codified rules inapplicable, to establish a light-touch regulatory framework tailored to preserving those provisions that advance our goals of more, better, and open broadband. We thus forbear from the vast majority of rules adopted under Title II. So what does that mean? It means the FCC basically said that they were not going to apply almost all of the Title II regulations that exist, right? They basically just said, we're reclassifying you as Title II because the DC Court of Appeal said we had to in order to have net neutrality. And then they said that almost everything aside from the net neutrality provisions won't apply. So to answer your question in very short, form, nothing. It made almost no difference in the operations of internet service providers, right? So the misinformation campaign on the right that this utility regulation is not a one-size-fit-all application that should be applied to internet service providers, that internet service providers are not the same thing as the AT&T of the 1970s or whatever. I mean, that's accurate, and the FCC already recognized that.
So you've got the open internet order, right? So let's make sure we're kind of going chronologically. So that gets issued in 2015.
Right.
And that open internet order is effectively the net neutrality order. Is it fair to call it that?
Yeah.
Or no?
I mean, I think it is accurate to call that the net neutrality order.
The most recent one.
Yeah, the most recent one. So then in 2017, so now, I guess on, November 14th or 13th, or not November, sorry, December 14th or 13th of 2017, Ajit Pai, who's the commissioner of the FCC, issued a new order.
And so the new order rescinds the 2015 order, right? It no longer applies the net neutrality rules to internet service providers.
So now that we have a little bit, or not a little bit, I think we have the background. So let's go back to my sort of three, not objections, but just questions, right? So the first is, when you as a consumer get internet service, right, on your laptop, or through whether it's through Comcast or Time Warner or whoever, that information is being delivered from some server that, in this situation, let's call it, is owned by Netflix, okay, and then it is going over what's called the internet backbone. And the internet backbone is not Comcast. Comcast doesn't own the internet backbone, right? So there's companies like Level 3 Communications is one of them. There's a whole bunch of other ones. There's another one called Zayo. These are companies that own the backbone, okay? And they are the ones that then hook up that Netflix server all the way to wherever your sort of local Comcast hub is, okay? And then Comcast delivers that content to you, to your laptop in your home, right? So now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that the backbone providers are allowed to discriminate. And by that, I mean they are allowed to cut sort of special deals, where they can say, hey, Netflix, if you want things to move across the backbone faster, you pay us, So if whether or not that's the case, I believe it is, but whether or not that's the case, why shouldn't Comcast be able to say, listen, it's our network. Like, we have a customer, and if that customer, doesn't like Comcast, then, they could switch to somebody else. But it's our network. Why can't we charge?
So I think you're talking about a different issue. So the issue with backbone providers and speedy access has to do with the physical limitations of the actual facilities that make the internet work, right? And so there's a concept called co-location, which is when you co-locate facilities, it means you take your facilities and you put them in the same location as someone else's facilities, right? So if you're a backbone provider, right, and you've got a bunch of servers and switches, and so you go to some city and there's some like Denver switching facility, and you put a bunch of servers right next to the switching facility. So they're in the same building, and they can transmit information to and from each other very quickly, right? Well, so one of the issues that Netflix has been having over the last 10 years is that these backbone providers charge fees for colocation, right? Like they own the property where their facilities are, and they can't just say anyone who wants to can come and drop off a computer, right? I mean, they have to be able to manage the access to their physical facilities. And so there's some like very reasonable explanation for why Netflix and Level 3 could have some disagreement about what are the terms by which Netflix can come by and drop off a computer so that some of their servers will be co-located with the Level 3 facilities, right? It is not just a market. It's not an effort to reshape the market, right? That Level 3 has this issue, right? It is a limitation of the physical facilities that cause the internet to work. By contrast, right, when you're talking about say Facebook paying for some sort of privileged access to the Indian broadband market, that's something else, right? Like that is an effort to use an incumbent firm's access to capital and position in the marketplace to create a market advantage for its product.
So to be fair, that happens in every market, right? So for example, the people that make like Mars bars or Snickers bars or whatever else, they pay grocery stores for shelf space, right? So they give rebates, they give discounts to the grocery store if their products are put like at a specific place on the shelf.
Right.
So that customers, will see that. So that sort of paying for preferred access concept, exists in a lot of other industries. And I'm sure people do cry foul, but nobody's really that worried about it. You know what I mean? So why is this different?
So like the difference is that like we don't really think of grocery stores as, public utilities, right? Imagine if...
eating's important.
Eating is important, right? But so the first thing is that something being on a higher or lower shelf is not that fundamental to your quality of life.
No. It is actually very fundamental. It's not fundamental to your quality of life, right? But neither is whether Netflix is a hair slower than Hulu, right?
But keep in mind one of the core concepts is that access to the internet is fundamental to your quality of life.
Sure. So you continue to get that access, right? So like, I don't think this, and honestly, like, listen, I think you guys know this, but to be clear, I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? But because I think it's helpful to sort of talk through these arguments and why they're valid or they're invalid, right? So you have grocery store.
Can I respond to that by giving
sure.
you an example from my very real world life? So I'm sitting here in my house.
Super real world.
Right? Yeah, super real world. I'm sitting here in my house. Just a couple of blocks away, there's a Central Market. Another couple of blocks the other way, there's an H-E-B. About 4 or 5...
Which is owned by Central Market.
Yeah, 4 or 5 blocks away, there's a Randall's. Across the street from the Randall's, there's a Costco. Next to the Costco, there's a Whole Foods. I can go, there's a Sprouts, catty corner to the H-E-B, basically.
Can you stop bragging, Tom? Can you stop bragging right now? Like, have you not bragged enough to me and AJ who don't have these facilities at our homes?
Can you guess how many internet service providers I have access to?
One or two. One or two.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the crucial difference.
Yeah, and I think that's the argument.
Right.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm trying to expose, right? Is that is the crucial difference. Is the reason in the first example that I would argue why isn't it just okay for Comcast or Verizon or whoever else to discriminate is because they're monopolists in their market, effectively. And so that means there isn't competition. If, as with grocery stores, there were, tons and tons of options, right? Or gas stations or anything else where there's so much competition that, if you are a brand and you can't get into... So if you're a brand, like you make special types of cookies, right? If you can't get into Costco or get a good deal at Costco, you might be able to get a good deal at Walmart. You could get a good deal at gas stations. You could get a good deal through, doing things, just through mail order, right? You have lots of options. And as a consumer, you have lots of options.
The other difference that I would point out is that even if we lived in a world where I, in my house, had access to 30 different internet providers, we would never live in a world where I would have simultaneous access to all 30 of those providers. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like I can hook up, Comcast, Time Warner.
No, that world could happen. So let me just give you an example of that world in action, though. There's an example of it. The example is the retail electricity market in Houston, right? So there are like 30 different retail electricity providers in Houston.
But hold on, that's not even what I was going to say, right? So what I mean is that you can't both simultaneously have Time Warner internet piping into your router and then to your computer, and Comcast internet piping into your router and your computer. Your computer can only connect to one internet service provider at a time. Does that make sense?
No, that does make sense. But what I'm saying is that you could choose, right, if it was important to you. And this, the Houston example is an apt one, right? in Houston, there are retail electric providers that are running on the same lines as everyone else, mind you, right? Because the transmission lines are regulated. So the retail interface may be different, but everybody's running on, transmission lines that are not publicly owned, but they're owned by a utility, right? Which gets a regulated rate of return. But what you have is you have an option in Houston, if you live there, if you want a retail electric provider where the customer service reps speak Hindi or Gujarati or Filipino, because, that's the language you want to speak to those reps in, or maybe your grandma wants to speak to those reps in that language, you can do that. If you want a retail electric provider that has only green energy that they're using, you can do that. So I can imagine a world.
That's not my point. That's not my point.
Well, no,
my
I
point,
can
hold on.
Well, hold on. Let Ruchit finish.
No, what I'm saying is I can imagine a world where the whoever laid the fiber into your house, right? One, that you could own that fiber connection, like period, right? You could just pay for it, you could own it. Otherwise, what could happen is that fiber connection gets a regulated rate of return, and then you choose whatever customer interface you want, and you could flip between customer interfaces. You could totally cancel Time Warner and then go to Comcast.
That wasn't my point. My point is there is a barrier in switching between internet service providers, right? That is. But even in the Houston market, right? You have to switch you have to switch electric companies, right? In comparing that to the grocery store example, there's no need to go through and turn off your connection to the H-E-B grocery store to get a connection to the Whole Foods grocery store. You know what I mean? That there's and no matter how easy you make that ability to switch, there's always going to be that sort of friction in having to switch providers that exists in the internet world that doesn't exist in that grocery shopping world.
Well, also, I have a 12-month contract with AT&T for my home internet, right? So even if it were really easy to switch, I mean, the retail providers...
But you don't have to do that. I mean, I have Google Fiber. I have a month-to-month, and you could totally...
Yeah, I don't have Google Fiber in my neighborhood. If I had Google Fiber, I'd use Google Fiber.
No, totally. I'm just saying that you could do month-to-month, right? That's a choice you're making because you're getting a discount, I imagine.
I don't think... No,
are they requiring you?
I mean, AT&T won't bring fiber to your house unless you sign a 12-month contract. So I mean, once my contract's over, I'll stay month to month, and my bill will be a little more expensive. But in order to have initiated service, my only option was a 12-month contract.
I don't have fiber. The best I can get is about 10 times slower than most fiber networks.
That's kind of the trade-off, though. You've got 12 grocery stores, but you don't have fiber. So, you're not... Some would say you're not really making good choices in life, but, I mean, this is what happens, though, when you live in a small town in Texas like Tom does, The small town Texas guy that you are.
Tom lives in a town of like 700 people.
Yeah.
Anyway.
He recently moved there. He decided big city life wasn't for him. He wanted to be closer to his government. Isn't that right, Tom?
I think the key point we're not really addressing is that I think all three of Ruchit's arguments rest on, it's some variation of, it's Comcast network, right? So it's Comcast network, and if they want to partner with an edge provider to make service more broadly available, then they should. Or it's Comcast network, and if they want to deprioritize certain content, they should. Or it's Comcast network, and if deprioritizing certain content will make service more affordable, then they should be able to do that. I think the answer to all three of those points, if the market were structured differently, right? If we had a different market structure, if the telecom industry were more like the electric industry, then none of the three of those would be possible, right? Like there would never be any sort of question that Facebook should be able to partner with your electricity company, but then they would get to choose the temperature of your thermostat. Right? Like we would never even consider that to be a reasonable option for consumers. And so I think
although, there are discounts. So for example, Austin Energy, right, which is our energy provider, gives a discount if you let them control your thermostat, right?
Kind of. Right. No, so what they do is called like a energy rush hour, and what it does is it adjusts your thermostat, but then you can just like turn it off immediately, right? They send you a message before they do it, and it adjusts your thermostat, and then you can walk over to your thermostat and change it back over, and there's no like consequence, right? I mean, this is different from like what Facebook is doing in India, where they just become the entire internet.
Yeah, so, I think of the three arguments that I sort of raised, maybe the one that I can sympathize with most is the highly subsidized internet option, right? And so I'll give you a few examples, right? So back in, I don't know if you guys remember this, but there used to be a dial-up service provider called Net Zero. Do you guys remember Net Zero? Do you remember that?
I used to have it, dude.
Yeah, okay, so you know what I'm talking about, right? So Net Zero had an option where they showed you ads, for example, right? And it was you got to choose, right? They showed you ads, and you got free internet access, right? And if you wanted ad free, I think you had to pay like $9.99 a month, right?
It was horrible.
Yeah, it was bad internet, but it was really cheap. And if you had no money and you really wanted to get on the internet, like that was something that you could do, right? It was an option. Then I'll give you another example. There was a service called All Advantage, okay? And I'm giving you stuff from sort of the early days of the internet here. So All Advantage was a service that existed like kind of in the, I want to call it like late 1990s, early 2000s. And what they let you do is they paid you to browse the internet, right? So not only did they sort of give you free internet, but they actually paid you. And so they had like they had ads all over your screen, right? That's how they were making money, obviously. And people would do this, right? Because it was worth it to them. So I guess my question becomes, if people don't care about receiving anything more than just Facebook, and in exchange they can pay next to nothing, or hell, even get paid for using the internet, what's so wrong with that?
Because that is a market opportunity that is only available to incumbent firms, and it's a market opportunity that is to be exploited by all of the vertical integration that there is in our communications marketplace, right? And so the idea, so like Verizon is out there owning tons of content production, and if you live in a market where Verizon is your only option for internet service, or is one of only two options for internet service, and you could imagine AT&T, and Disney merging, and Verizon owning Viacom, and then you have to choose. Like, I either get to watch, I either get to watch Arrested Development, or I get to watch Modern Family, and I don't get to watch both.
So that's definitely a good bogeyman that you've painted there, AJ. But
can I give another response to that? Like, just at a fundamental level, the internet is very crucial to the way most people live lives, and it's only going to get more and more fundamental to our way of life, right? And to provide some people with substandard access because they are poor and can't afford it seems like a bad thing to me.
To me, I'd rather have those people have extremely cheap internet, and then they get like a limited set of things, than to have no internet at all, right? And they could always choose to pay more, right? That choice continues to exist. I think of all the net neutrality arguments, that's the one that comes closest to sort of persuading me, which is that, it really could, and that's partly because I've seen it, I've seen it with, things like Net Zero and All Advantage and things like that. And now, thankfully, I was never in a position where the only way that I could get internet was All Advantage, or was by getting paid for All Advantage, or the only way I could get internet was by using stupid Net Zero. I don't know. I feel those are real life examples where I feel uncomfortable foreclosing those options if they can really dramatically reduce cost, which in those cases it did, right?
I have a real thought experiment I want to ask you about, and then I have two news items, and I think we should probably move on.
Yeah, I agree. We should call it an episode. It's been a good episode.
I personally don't really think that consumers are going to notice the pernicious ways that that ISPs will take advantage of the repeal of the net neutrality order. I think that some like the boogeyman about how it's going to cost $5 extra to access Facebook and it's going to cost $10 extra to access Netflix and things like that, or the idea that you'll have to choose between being able to watch Modern Family or Arrested Development, although it's not much of a choice. The
obviously you watch Modern Family.
Oh Jesus.
That's a pretty easy one.
I think that those actually are sort of boogeyman, and I don't think that those are the most likely outcome, although I think that they are sort of very serious outcomes. I think it's much more likely, like what Ruchit is saying, that Facebook will be cheaper, right? You'll feel like you're getting a discount. Like, oh, I'm a Verizon mobile broadband subscriber, and therefore, streaming NFL games doesn't count against my bandwidth limits or something, right?
Yeah.
Like people will experience it as a discount, right? Which is purely like a function of like anchoring and how costs are communicated to consumers, right? But I think for the most part, broadly speaking, net neutrality is very popular among consumers. But I think the actual ways that net neutrality will not be implemented by ISPs will not be perceived as all that negative.
Yeah, so there was a tweet that somebody shared on the Slack. Maybe it was you, AJ, or maybe it was ARPS. I forget. But I think that tweet kind of hit net. I mean, and this is sort of what you talked about is maybe the longer version of that tweet. I think that's exactly what will happen. I think it will very slowly chip away at access. And one of the examples, I guess, that I've made in arguing against net neutrality, which I'll share here, is to me the internet, and especially like Comcast and like all of these internet service providers, they're kind of like the railroads. And so in America, we had a situation where there were preferred terms that you could get if you were a large farm, right? And what that did is it destroyed every small farm. Not because their grain or their potatoes or whatever else was any worse, but because they couldn't afford to pay the subsidies to the railroad. And I think that's what happens, is that if you want to, one of the great things about the internet has been that it's been largely a merit-based thing. It hasn't been necessarily a money-based thing. And the cost to sort of start a business on the internet has been like extremely low, right? Whether it's to get on Etsy, if you're going to do something small, or to get on Amazon EC2 and build a business that could really scale. Either way, the cost to build a business, a technology business, has been going down drastically over the last like 20 years. And to me, this may raise some of those costs. If you want to create a consumer media company of any kind, and you have to pay to basically get access to the railroads, to the modern day railroads, your ability to launch a business is going to go down. And that's going to hurt consumers over the long run. In the short run, yeah, they'll get discounts, right? In the short run, they will get discounts.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Did you guys see this article that's going around about the FCC blocking law enforcement investigation into net neutrality comment fraud?
Really? I haven't heard of that. I'm not surprised by it, but I haven't heard of that.
And the subtitle is, "In addition, the agency told me there was nothing that it could do after someone hijacked my identity to claim I falsely supported killing net neutrality protections." Apparently, there was a flood of comment. So, before the FCC passes or issues rules, like any other agency, it has to go through a notice and comment period where they give notice to everyone that, hey, we're considering passing this rule. Do people have anything to say about it? And in the comment period, they wait and take comments, review those comments, and then when they pass the rule or not pass the rule, they refer to the comments. A lot of people said this about the rule. We don't think that's going to be applicable. They have to consider the comments that are issued in the wake of the net neutrality rulemaking. There were millions and millions of comments that were provided on both sides, and then some academic folks did an analysis of the comments that were provided against the or in favor of repealing net neutrality, and they found, sort of like how you can do analysis of Amazon reviews to see who are like fake and who are not based on what they're saying. And they found that a lot of these reviews were fraudulent. And so people were trying to investigate, figure out, okay, where are these reviews coming from? Who is, who's doing this? And, this article that we'll link to in the show notes is about the FCC doesn't want anyone looking into it.
Dude.
Seems bad.
That's like, that's pretty shady. I mean, it just seems like nothing's going to take him off that, other than, an election or some lawsuits. So I say bring on the lawsuits.
Yeah, so I guess that's a question we didn't address in our discussion is, after a rule like this is either passed or repealed, there's going to be a series of lawsuits. Does anyone have any hot takes on what form they think those lawsuits will take?
So the governor of Washington State has already said that Washington is planning to sue to stop the net neutrality repeal, and they're going to act under their own authority to adopt their own laws to try to replace the net neutrality order. I think sort of that both of those efforts will not be particularly successful. It's not.
I think the lawsuits could be successful, right? Because doesn't Pi have to argue that something has changed in the last 2 years, and that's the basis for why he's withdrawing the FCC's 2015 open internet order?
No, I mean, he could just say that the order was ill-advised in the first place, right? I don't know why you'd have to explain what's changed to the marketplace, right?
Oh.
Right, because think about it this way, right? You wouldn't want, imagine the EPA adopts some rule that says that it's okay to spray sludge everywhere, and then 2 years later, the next administration repeals that. You wouldn't want to have to go to the courts and explain what's changed in the market that makes sludge worse now than it was in 2014, right? You would just want you would want them to be able to repeal that as soon as possible. So if the net neutrality order really is so awful, I'm not sure why you'd have to explain what in particular is different from 2014.
Yeah, I guess I just don't know.
On a side note, did you guys see a water fountain at the EPA backed up and started spewing sewage into the hallway?
I saw that.
Dude, that was so terrible.
A weird metaphor.
You want to do a Supreme Court case?
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple of choices. We can do a case about taxes, or we can do a case about the Fourth Amendment.
Taxes.
Oh, man. All right. So this case is Marinello v. United States, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But the basic issue in this case is: are you obstructing justice when you pay your lawnmower in cash, knowing that he will not report that cash payment to the IRS? Stated another way, is a cash-only business structure obstruction of justice?
No.
The legal way of saying it is, does a conviction under 26 U.S.C. 7212A for corruptly endeavoring to obstruct or impede the due administration of tax laws require that the government prove the defendant acted with knowledge of a pending Internal Revenue Service action? But the practical effect of this, and the way that the IRS was going after this individual was, he was basically in a cash-only business. So this guy, Carlo J. Marinello, owned and operated a freight transport company. And between 1992 and 2010, he basically didn't keep records of any kind, really. And he definitely did not file any taxes, personal or corporate. He dealt almost exclusively in cash for his freight business. Didn't keep much records, and the records that he did have, he destroyed them as a matter of course. Now, he was charged under 26 U.S.C. 7212, which is a statute that makes it a crime, and this is the language of the statute, to corruptly obstruct or impede or endeavor to obstruct or impede the due administration of this title, which is basically tax collecting, right? And he's not challenging, at the Supreme Court, he's not challenging the constitutionality of this statute, because at the Supreme Court, when you have a statute that's as broad as this, you can do one of a couple of things. One, you can say, look, this is unconstitutionally vague, which means, it's so broad, the statute is so broad that a reasonable person would not be able to understand what is illegal and what's not. It's just way too broad, way too vague, way too ambiguous. So that's one way you can attack attack a statute. That's not the tact he's taking in this case. And instead, he's saying, look, yeah, it is very broad, but it's so broad that the statute as written as a statutory matter, Congress must have intended the statute to be limited only to those defendants who have knowledge of a pending investigation, right? So that's his argument. Look, yeah, it reads broad, but we can interpret this statute to mean that, you can only obstruct the IRS if the IRS is investigating you and you're trying to do something to hide or prevent them from discovering your wrongdoings, right? The IRS has a different take. They're basically saying, no, we can do, you can obstruct justice anyway, right? Even if we're not investigating you, if you know that, if we can prove you intend for this transaction, this cash transaction, to impede our investigation at some point in the future, right, or impede the collection of taxes at some point in the future, and this is key to the case because in Marinello's case, he did not know that he was being investigated or was under investigation for this for basically not filing taxes. So he's saying, look, you gotta know that there's an investigation going on. You can't just, if you're just paying your lawnmower in cash, right? That's not obstruction of justice. So that.
Do you want to give? Sorry, that was a little long. Do you want to give cap it off? Like, what is the very short question?
Yeah, the question is, is this statute so broad that obstruction of justice could be, you're paying your lawnmower in cash?
Yeah, the answer is no. There's no way that you can be convicted of obstruction of justice for paying your lawnmower in cash without actual knowledge of a pending IRS investigation.
I just can't believe that this. I mean, I can't believe the IRS had the gall to sort of to do this. You know what I mean? Like, I guess I can believe it because they're the IRS, but come on,
I think 7-2.
This is terrible precedent. This is gonna be 9-0, dude. It's gonna be 9-0.
I could see Thomas and Alito or Thomas and Gorsuch in the dissent.
There's no way that I see Gorsuch or Thomas saying that this is possible. Especially Gorsuch. I mean, do you know how many corporations would be criminals if you could have obstruction of justice just for paying in cash? I mean, anyway, and he would never want that.
So, Ruch, you think it's 9-0 Marinello for the defendant? AJ, what's your count?
8-1.
8-1 for the defendant, Marinello?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's going to be 9-0 Marinello too. I mean, it's just, I mean, the statute just way too broad the way that the IRS is reading it and the IRS is arguing to the Supreme Court, that I can't imagine that we won't have 9 votes to narrow it down at least somewhat. Honestly, I'm a little surprised he didn't challenge the constitutionality of it, but
All right, let's do sidebars and call it.
Yeah,
Rich, what's your sidebar?
Can we start with Tom's sidebar because I need to pull up my sidebar? I've got to figure out what thing to recommend for shopping purposes.
Oh my gosh!
All right, Tom.
Oh my gosh! All right. So my sidebar is something AJ and I went and did last night. We went out into the middle of nowhere and took Star Trail photos, and it was pretty cool. I would think. I'm going to link to the photo that I got, but basically it's this procedure where you take or several photos of the night sky and you can stack those photos together to show how stars are moving in the night sky. So not only does it look cool, but it rebuts the idea that we live on a flat Earth.
I don't know why you do this, Tom. Why do you like try and prove things that are science when you could just, sort of live a perfectly happy life?
Yeah, I guess I could. No, but it was a lot of fun. Like this was my first time doing it, and so like the photo isn't like the best, but learning the process makes me want to do it a lot more. It is time intensive though. Like this, the photo that I'm linking to is the result of maybe an hour's worth of work, and I think after doing it and compiling it together. I would say like you got to go out there for at least a couple of hours if you want a decent photo, a decent star trail photo. And but like the longer you do it, the better photo you can get. And the more cool looking photo you can get too. But it's neat that the stars are above us moving in relation. Well, they're not moving. I guess we're moving, but it's neat. To see the movement in the sky.
Yeah,
that is pretty cool.
I had a lot of fun. I definitely didn't have close to ideal equipment, and my photos didn't turn out very good. But I had a lot of fun standing outside taking photos of the sky.
It was good.
My sidebar is called Griffin's Amiibo Corner. That's it.
Is this something?
That's all I prepared.
Is this something that we should watch?
Yeah, it's a YouTube series. So Griffin McElroy lives in Austin, Texas. He works for the video game website Polygon.com, and their video content is like sort of extraordinary. It's just weird. I mean, I think sort of in the same way that Top Gear was really not actually it was not really about cars. It was about three men being belligerent at each other near cars. A lot of the Polygon video content is sort of funny, even if you have no background in video games. And so I put a link in the Slack to the very first episode of Griffin's Amiibo Corner. But the series ran for about a year. Did 12 episodes and ran for about a year through 2016. But you should watch the first episode of Griffin's Amiibo Corner.
Okay, I guess we can do that.
So, guys, my sidebar is...
Wait,
yeah.
Rich. We're still going to watch the video. We're going to talk about it. You got to click on it. Click on it.
Oh.
You got to click on the video now.
Okay, I'm watching it, I guess.
Look. He's got a little Mario figure. An amiibo is a little figurine that Nintendo makes.
AJ, this video is too long, dude. It's 1:49.
He's eating the amiibo.
He's eating the amiibo. He's putting it in his mouth.
AJ, we're into different things, dude. I've concluded we're into different things.
You think so? I think this is a good thing to be into. What don't you like about it? He couldn't get his mouth to close all the way around the Mario amiibo.
I don't know about that for me, AJ. Right. I think that may be an acquired taste.
Yeah, I'm laying on the floor waiting to die.
Classic.
Well, all right, Rich, what's your sidebar?
Yeah, so my sidebar is this it's another podcast actually. And it's called The Uncertain Hour. It's by the Marketplace people. And each season they go with a sort of different topic. So the first season they talked about kind of the history of the welfare system. And this season they're talking about regulations and specifically OxyContin. So anyway, I think it's pretty interesting. And so if you want to just kind of learn in depth detail about one of these two topics, I think you could totally listen to this podcast. And they dedicate it. To me, it reminded me a little bit of Serial, which was another great podcast. But Serial obviously being focused on one like criminal case, and this being focused on sort of like one topic and then trying to go deep into that topic, which I'm a fan of people that want to do that. And obviously, we try to do that here on the show.
I'll have to listen to a couple episodes of it.
Yeah. I think we should all do that. I think that'd be fun. But cool, dude. Well, this is what I got today, guys. I've got a new computer. I've got some. Okay, can we end the show? Can I stop recording so I can talk about my Warbies? It was a good show, guys. I thought we got to the point. I thought we explained things pretty well, you know?
We didn't talk about Alabama, though.
That's okay. I think Alabama is not like a permanent topic in the way that like net neutrality might be or something like that, you know? I mean, Alabama is permanent in the sense that, you know, Alabama will probably exist for some time still. Probably longer than they otherwise would have.
Doug Jones won Alabama.
Yeah. I mean, that was pretty good, right? The AJ, I never clapped, dude. Like, we need to redo the clap.
Don't worry about the clapping.
Okay. I mean, I'm very excited that Doug Jones won Alabama. You know, I'm glad that Roy Moore didn't win Alabama. Guys, we're not on the Apple App Store's 2017 list of most popular podcasts. Did you guys know we're not on that list?
Is it because Doug Jones won?
Or is it because Roy Moore lost?
Oh.
Can I say one thing real quick about this Doug Jones situation? Do you know he's like probably not actually going to get to join the Senate until January?
Yeah. I knew that.
It seems like he should already be in the Senate.
Why?
Because he won.
Well, I mean, December 26th is the earliest he can be sworn in. And, you know, I mean, the Republicans did this to Al Franken, too, right? He didn't get sworn in for like 6 months or something because there was like a recount. And I don't know if there will be a recount in this situation. But, I mean, it seems like Doug Jones being seated today or being seated in January won't really make a difference.
Well, if he's seated today, there's a more likely chance he can prevent the tax bill from going through.
No, I mean, I think they have all the votes. They have 51. Even if he was there, it would be 51-49. Because McCain's for it, Rubio's for it, Corker's now announced that he's for it. You know, so
I kind of think Doug Jones winning has caused Republicans to sort of abandon any sort of like long-term hope for control of the legislature, and they're really just trying to shove through what they can before the end of the year.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think they know they're going to lose probably by a lot, and so they just they just want to get what they can get done. If they can get one or two policy victories, then you know they can go home and be happy about themselves, and maybe they can just, I mean, you know, this gives them something to run on in the sense that like now you have a tax bill, and hey, you know, they can beat their chests and say, you know, I think they could turn this into a "we finally repealed Obamacare" thing.
Oh,
you know?
They definitely will. They definitely will.
Yeah, so they could go back to their voters and say, hey, we repealed Obamacare. We delivered on this tax cut. Like, you know, enjoy your $12 that you got. You know what I mean? And now we're about to take away any welfare benefits that you might have gotten.
All right. Here's what I think. Jonah's nap is over, and so I think we should go. But I propose we end on a funny note about Doug Jones, and that I don't include all of this healthcare stuff in the episode.
You can cut all the healthcare stuff, sure.
I'm going to cut all the healthcare stuff, but can someone just say one funny thing about Doug Jones so I can use that to close the show?
Make America boring again. That's Doug Jones.
No. Okay, I can't use that. Tom, your turn.
You know, I don't know if there is a lot funny about Doug Jones. He seems like a very serious guy. Oh, you know, there is something funny about him. He in reference, so someone asked him like in an interview, how is he going to staff, right? And he made a reference to staffing the best and the brightest based on some book title he had read. But apparently this book title was using that phrase in an ironic manner. Okay, maybe that's not funny, but
Tom, I'm not laughing.
He made a flub.
All right, Tom flubbed it. Tom flubbed it, and that's the end of the episode. Later, y'all.